In the shadowed forests of Europe during the height of the Second World War, Allied soldiers maneuvered with extreme caution, aware that every step could expose them to ambush, mines, or the unpredictable fury of the battlefield. Yet even the most battle-hardened veterans could not have anticipated the psychological terror that would descend upon German forces when whispers began to circulate about a weapon so enigmatic, so unprecedented, and so terrifying that entire battalions reportedly froze in place at its mere mention. A weapon whose very existence was officially classified, hidden from public knowledge, yet which had been deployed with calculated precision against enemy lines, and the Marines, engineers, and operatives who handled it approached their mission with a mixture of reverence, fear, and meticulous focus, knowing that a single misstep could transform this instrument of awe into a catastrophic liability, a duality that heightened the suspense exponentially, because it was not merely a matter of physical firepower, but of psychological domination, of fear weaponized into strategy. And as the first whispers reached the front lines, German soldiers described experiences that defied conventional military analysis, trembling at distant noises, sensing invisible threats, and witnessing explosions, lights, and destructive effects that seemed almost supernatural. And this combination of myth, rumor, and empirical destruction amplified the suspense to almost unbearable levels, because both the operator and the observer became locked into a narrative of anticipation, dread, and hypnotic attention, where the unknown became as lethal as any projectile, where each shadow in the woods, each flicker of light, each unusual vibration on the ground could signal the presence of this forbidden instrument. And as the weapon was prepared for its first tactical use, engineers and soldiers meticulously calibrated every component, knowing that even the slightest deviation could result in failure. Yet the successful deployment would deliver both devastating impact and psychological shock, a dual effect that modern strategists had long theorized but seldom witnessed in real combat. And as the first German patrol encountered the aftermath of the weapons deployment, entire squads reportedly dropped their weapons, eyes wide with disbelief, scanning the terrain for explanations that did not exist, their minds racing to reconcile what they saw with what they had been trained to expect, because the weapon operated on principles that defied conventional understanding. A perfect synthesis of science, ingenuity, and the terrifying potential of unpredictability and the suspense, tension, and awe generated by this encounter rippled outward through every level of command, from foot soldiers to high-ranking officers, creating a cascading psychological effect that reinforced both fear and respect. And as Allied forces observed the German reaction from hidden positions, they were acutely aware of the magnitude of the psychological victory in addition to the physical results. Because the weapon's mere presence had altered the behavior of enemy forces, slowing advances, inducing hesitancy, and creating opportunities that would otherwise have been impossible to exploit. And this interplay between action and perception, between fear and strategy, became the defining element of the mission. As every movement, every deployment, every calculated risk was measured against the backdrop of uncertainty and suspense. And the operators of the weapon understood that their role was not only to execute, but to craft a narrative of omnipotence, visibility, and inevitability, ensuring that every German soldier confronted with the instrument would be forced into a psychological state where their instincts for survival collided with their inability to comprehend the source or mechanism of the threat, creating moments of frozen indecision, sudden panic, and strategic collapse that could decide the outcome of skirmishes, battles, and campaigns. And this duality, real destruction, coupled with perceived invincibility, was what made the weapon truly forbidden, because it transcended conventional arms, blending terror, uncertainty, and technological marvel into a single, cohesive instrument capable of striking both mind and body with equal force. And as the initial deployments continued across multiple fronts, reports began to arrive detailing the extraordinary effectiveness of the weapon. Entire defensive positions abandoned, units retreating without engagement, soldiers recounting flashes, sounds, or effects that seemed to emanate from nowhere. and high-ranking German commanders convened emergency councils to analyze, hypothesize, and attempt to counteract what they called the invisible terror, a situation that only increased suspense and mythologized the weapon further, creating a feedback loop where fear amplified perception. Perception amplified the weapon's impact, and the battlefield became a theater of both tangible destruction and psychological domination. And every Allied operative involved in the deployment of the weapon became acutely aware of their role. It's not just in combat, but in shaping legend, in reinforcing the aura of invincibility that would haunt the enemy. And as the sun rose over the war-torn fields, illuminating craters, ruined fortifications, and scattered equipment, the combination of visual destruction, audible chaos, and unseen threat created an almost cinematic tableau, one that could be described in meticulous detail to convey suspense, horror, and awe simultaneously. And this tableau formed the backbone of a story that would captivate viewers, hold their attention, and maintain suspense from the very first second. Because the narrative was not merely about a weapon or a battle, but about the interplay between human psychology, technological innovation, and the unpredictable chaos of war, a narrative that demanded the audience's engagement, emotional investment, and complete immersion, ensuring that every viewer would remain riveted, heart-pounding, mind-racing, an imagination fired with the terror, awe, and suspense of the forbidden weapon that struck fear into German soldiers. As the sun climbed higher, casting long, shifting shadows across the devastated terrain, the operators of the secret weapon moved with methodical precision, each gesture deliberate, every lever and dial calibrated to perfection. Because even the smallest misalignment could not only reduce the physical impact, but also undermine the psychological effect that made the weapon so formidable. And the suspense was tangible, a constant electric current running through both the Allies deploying it and the German soldiers unknowingly facing it. As every footstep, every rustle of leaves, every faint mechanical whine of the weapon heightened awareness, anticipation, and tension. And this tension was compounded by the fact that the weapon's mechanism was unlike anything the Germans had ever encountered. A convergence of innovation, engineering brilliance, and strategic foresight that had been carefully concealed, tested in secrecy, and now unleashed with meticulous timing to maximize both physical destruction and mental terror. And as the first volleys of the weapon struck, the chaos unfolded in ways that transcended ordinary combat. Fortifications crumbling, ammunition stores igniting, communication lines severed, and troops scattering in confusion, their training colliding with incomprehensible stimuli, creating an almost cinematic tableau of fear, awe, and suspense, where every visual detail, the flash of energy, the shrapnel arcing through the air, the terrified expressions of soldiers frozen mid-action contributed to a narrative of extreme psychological pressure, and observers on both sides could feel the story unfolding in real time, the tension thickening with each successive strike, each unexpected effect, each terrified reaction. And the operators themselves were acutely aware that they were not only shaping the battlefield but also shaping legend, crafting a narrative of invisible omnipotence that would ripple through enemy ranks, slowing advances, breaking morale, and forcing German commanders into reactive, defensive postures that only reinforced the weapon's reputation. A reputation that grew with every eyewitness account, every written report, and every whispered conversation in the aftermath of engagements. And this reputation became a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the fear it inspired amplified its perceived power, causing hesitation, miscalculations, and errors that magnified the weapon's effectiveness beyond its tangible capabilities. And as the Allies continued to deploy the weapon across multiple fronts, the psychological impact became as critical as the physical impact. Because soldiers confronted with a phenomenon they could not understand or anticipate often reacted with panic, confusion, and compliance, abandoning positions or failing to execute strategies that would otherwise have been routine. And this interplay between real and perceived threat created a level of suspense and drama that would be impossible to replicate in any narrative outside of direct experience. ensuring that any story told about the weapon would have to balance awe-inspiring technical detail, high-stakes suspense, and the raw human emotion of fear and disbelief. And the operators, recognizing this dual role of destruction and legend crafting, maintained meticulous records, documented every reaction, and refined tactics to maximize both effectiveness and psychological impact, all while navigating the dangers inherent in the field, where misfires, mechanical failure, or enemy countermeasures could turn a tool of terror into a liability, and the suspense was continuous, relentless. Because the outcome of every deployment, every engagement, every tactical decision was uncertain, and this uncertainty amplified fear on both sides, creating the perfect storm of tension, drama, and narrative intrigue, where the weapon functioned as both literal and symbolic instrument, representing not just power, but the terrifying unpredictability of technological advancement in the hands of skilled operators. And as German soldiers reported back to their commanders, the accounts ranged from incredulous disbelief to outright panic, with descriptions of flashes, sounds, and destructive effects that seemed impossible, further deepening the mythos surrounding the weapon. And the psychological pressure spread like wildfire, influencing morale, strategy, and operational effectiveness. And as Allied forces observed the outcomes, they understood the importance of precise deployment, timing, and coordination to maintain the delicate balance between physical damage and mental terror. Because the full effect of the weapon depended on sustaining both, a duality that created suspense at every moment, in every interaction, and in every conceivable scenario. A narrative tension so intricate, continuous, and immersive that any audience hearing it would be compelled to remain fully engaged, with hearts racing, minds alert, and emotions fully activated. As the story of the forbidden weapon unfolded with every strike, every reaction, and every shadow of anticipation on the battlefield, the forest canopy swayed gently above. Yet beneath it, the atmosphere was thick with tension, as soldiers on both sides moved with heightened awareness, acutely attuned to every sound, shadow, and vibration. Because the secret weapon's unique ability to strike unpredictably instilled a fear that transcended conventional battlefield hazards, and the suspense was compounded by the fact that its operators often remained unseen, their movements obscured by terrain, smoke, and deliberate deception. A strategy designed to amplify uncertainty and keep the enemy in a perpetual state of anticipation and psychological stress. And as the weapon discharged for the first time in a live engagement, the destructive effects were immediately apparent. Explosions erupted with precise timing. Projectiles detonated unexpectedly, and the very ground seemed to tremble, creating an environment of chaos and awe that forced German soldiers to question the reliability of their senses, the efficacy of their weapons, and even the basic rules of warfare they had been trained to follow. And this induced uncertainty produced a cascade of reactions, from hesitation to full-scale retreat, because the human mind, confronted with phenomena it cannot rationalize, defaults to fear and extreme caution. And in this case, the combination of tangible destruction and the incomprehensible nature of the weapon's effects created a psychological pressure cooker in which every decision carried heightened stakes. And observers noted that entire platoons froze mid-action, unable to advance or respond, their instincts overridden by the seemingly supernatural impact of a technology that blended physical force with a carefully orchestrated aura of terror. And as the Allies monitored these outcomes, the operators of the weapon understood that each deployment reinforced its legend, transforming it from a simple tool of war into an almost mythical presence on the battlefield, capable of shaping perception as much as reality. And the suspense generated by this duality, visible destruction paired with the unknown, was palpable, nearly tangible, like an electric current running through the troops, tightening nerves, accelerating heartbeats, and sharpening focus, yet simultaneously amplifying fear. A tension that could be captured and conveyed to an audience with meticulous attention to detail, ensuring that every element, the flash of fire, the shrapnel arcs, the terrified expressions, the whispered rumors, and the sudden vacuums of sound in between explosions contributed to a narrative of escalating suspense, engagement, and astonishment. And as reports of the weapon spread among German ranks, the psychological effects multiplied, because the stories themselves, retold with embellishment and fear, fed into the perception of omnipotence, making every soldier a participant in a continuous cycle of terror, anticipation, and heightened vigilance, which in turn increased operational hesitation and error. Exactly the intended effect of the weapon's deployment. And this recursive interplay of myth, fear, and reality created a battlefield environment in which suspense and engagement were not merely byproducts, but essential components of strategy, ensuring that the weapon's influence extended far beyond its physical impact, shaping morale, movement, and decision-making in ways that could decisively alter the outcomes of skirmishes and campaigns. And as operators carefully documented each engagement, noting both technical performance and human response, they refined tactics to maximize this dual effect, deploying the weapon in ways that accentuated unpredictability, reinforced legend, and maintained suspense for maximum strategic and psychological advantage, and the continuous layering of threat, destruction, and uncertainty created a narrative that could hold any audience completely captivated, sustaining tension from the very first moment of discovery through every subsequent development, with no relief from the suspense, no respite from the anticipation. A relentless unfolding of awe, fear, and astonishment that mirrored the very experiences of those soldiers confronting the weapon for the first time. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows and bathing the battlefield in dramatic golden hues, the combination of visible chaos, psychological domination, and narrative potential coalesced into a story of extraordinary suspense, one that could hold viewers enthralled from beginning to end, drawing them into the terror strategy. An innovation of a weapon that transcended conventional warfare. A weapon whose story demanded full attention, emotional engagement, and intellectual curiosity, sustaining the suspense and drama without pause, as the forbidden instrument of fear struck relentlessly into both the battlefield and the imagination. The battlefield lay eerily silent as dawn broke over the scarred terrain, and the remnants of shattered bunkers and scorched earth bore witness to a weapon so devastating, so enigmatic, that German soldiers who survived its onslaught would recount the terror for decades to come. And from the first moment they glimpsed its presence in ominous silhouette, partially obscured by smoke and foliage, moving with deliberate precision, the fear gripped them instantly. A paralyzing dread unlike any they had experienced before, because they had trained for artillery, machine guns, even tanks, but never for a weapon that seemed to operate beyond the boundaries of understanding, blending lethal power with psychological domination. And as it unleashed its first volleys, explosions ripped through the air with a rhythm that defied prediction, sending tremors through the earth and throwing dirt, debris, and shattered equipment into the sky. And the soldiers' reactions were instantaneous. They froze, dropped their weapons, and scanned the horizon with wide, incredulous eyes, hearts pounding, minds scrambling to reconcile what they were witnessing with everything they thought they knew about warfare. And each successive strike magnified the suspense, the horror, and the awe, because the weapon's effects were both tangible and surreal, damaging infrastructure, obliterating obstacles, and simultaneously creating a psychological weight that immobilized the enemy, an invisible force of fear that transcended ordinary tactics. And as Allied operators observed from concealed positions, they realized the genius of this dual impact. The weapon did not merely destroy, it controlled, it dictated the pace of engagement. It forced the enemy to act not from strategy, but from fear, hesitation, and disbelief. And the suspense was electric. A tension so intense that even the most battle-hardened veterans could feel their pulse quicken, their nerves straining, because at that moment, every action, every decision, every heartbeat counted, and the narrative of the weapon's power was written in real time with each terrified glance, each frozen stance, each retreating step, ensuring that the story would be both awe-inspiring and unforgettable. And as the engagement reached its climax, The weapons operators executed a sequence of maneuvers that combined speed, precision, and unpredictability, producing effects so dramatic that even the terrain seemed alive. The trees trembling, the smoke twisting unnaturally, the sunlight fractured through clouds in a way that accentuated every movement, every explosion, every terrified reaction, creating a cinematic tableau of destruction, fear, and ultimate control. And as the Germans attempted to regroup, confusion reigned, orders went unheeded, and the battlefield became a theater of psychological domination. A living testament to the weapon's legendary status, and as the smoke cleared, the silence that followed was deafening. The aftermath visually stunning, the emotional impact unforgettable. And every surviving soldier, operator, and observer alike understood that what had transpired was not merely a battle, but a demonstration of the terrifying convergence of technology, strategy, and human psychology, a spectacle of suspense, fear, and awe that demanded to be remembered, recounted, and revered. And for the audience watching this story unfold, the intensity, drama, and sheer incredulity of the final moments would ensure total engagement. Hearts racing, minds enthralled, eyes glued to the narrative, and the forbidden weapon would live forever in their imagination as an instrument of fear, power, and suspense. Concluding the saga with a climactic crescendo that left viewers breathless, amazed, and compelled to revisit every detail of the unimaginable. Events that made it the most terrifying weapon German soldiers had ever faced.